In a world increasingly dominated by noise, complexity, and chaos, there exists a rare type of individual who seems to feel life more deeply than the rest. Their sensitivity is not a weakness, but a spiritual signature, a symbolic reflection of the unconscious attempting to find balance in the conscious world. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And the empath, often misunderstood, mislabeled, and even spiritually attacked, walks that privilege out through the alchemy of feeling. Today, we journey into the psyche of the rare empath through the lens of Jungian depth psychology. We will uncover the mystical energy that surrounds them, often sensed but seldom understood, the empathic aura. It is more than emotion. It is intuition sharpened by suffering, a portal between shadow and self, a quiet force that holds the power to heal, transform, and awaken the collective unconscious. Jung didn't use the word empath, yet everything he wrote pointed toward them. So what is the hidden power of this aura? Why does the world often push these souls to the margins? And how can this archetype become not just a wounded healer, but a conscious channel of divine purpose? In this lecture, we will decode Jung's symbols, confront the shadow, and reveal the sacred psychology behind the empath's rare aura. Let us begin this inner pilgrimage. The empath, as understood through the lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, aligns closely with what Jung described as the archetype of the wounded healer and the mystic. This archetype is deeply symbolic, reaching into the collective unconscious where patterns of human experience are stored beyond time and culture. The empath is not merely a person with heightened emotional sensitivity, but rather an archetypal force moving through a human vessel, someone who embodies the healing power that emerges from personal wounding. In Jung's exploration of archetypes, he repeatedly emphasizes that the healer often becomes capable of guiding others through darkness only because they themselves have journeyed through it. The empath's path, therefore, is not a simple matter of feeling too much, but a soul-assigned role that demands profound inner work, often marked by suffering, isolation, and a deep existential awareness. Their pain is not incidental, it is alchemical. Jung did not use the term empath as we know it today, but his language of the self, the archetypes, and the process of individuation speaks directly to this type of person. The empath finds themselves profoundly affected by the emotions of others, often absorbing unspoken energies and subtle shifts in emotional tone. This isn't just intuition, it's a psychic resonance that reflects the mystic's role as a bridge between the seen and unseen realms, like the ancient shamans Jung studied and wrote about. The empath walks between worlds, feeling deeply, dreaming vividly, and carrying burdens that do not originate with them but are nonetheless carried for collective healing. The wounded healer, an archetype present in the myths of Chiron and countless others, must confront their own suffering before they can transmute it into medicine for others. The empath is no different. Their emotional wounds are the crucibles in which spiritual insight is forged on in Jungian theory. Every individual must eventually confront their shadow, the hidden parts of the psyche that contain suppressed emotions, disowned traits, and unlived potential. For the empath, this confrontation often begins earlier in life. Because of their deep sensitivity, they become hyper-aware of others' emotional states. Often at the cost of losing touch with their own, they carry emotional burdens from family systems, often becoming the emotional barometer in chaotic or dysfunctional environments. This is not coincidental. The empath is frequently born into systems that require healing. This is part of the archetypal calling. Their early experiences with pain, trauma, or rejection serve as the unconscious initiation into the deeper mysteries of life. But the empath's mistake, if we could call it that, is assuming their role is to save others while neglecting themselves. In doing so, they risk remaining wounded rather than evolving into healers. Jung would say that empath must individuate. This is not a rejection of others, but a sacred return to the self. In individuation, the conscious mind unites with the unconscious, resulting in a more integrated and whole person. The empath, when walking this path, becomes aware of their spiritual assignment not just as a mirror for others' pain, but as a soul charged with the responsibility to alchemize pain into wisdom. Their healing doesn't come through avoidance or suppression, but through conscious descent into their wounds, a symbolic journey into the underworld. They are called not only to feel but to see, to interpret dreams, to read energy, to perceive the symbols in life's patterns, and to listen to what others ignore. This capacity to interpret emotional and psychic information makes them mystics by default. They live between dimensions, conscious of the spiritual, even while grounded in the physical. Empaths are often drawn to spiritual disciplines, dream analysis, and intuitive practices not because they seek novelty, but because their inner world demands language. Jung's depth psychology gives the empath a vocabulary to understand their own mystical makeup. The rare empath aura, that sense of presence and emotional charge others feel around them, is not merely a personality trait but a spiritual vibration. It's the consequence of carrying archetypal energy, which affects the field around them. Jung believed that energy is contagious, that psychological contents could move between people in a way akin to energetic transference. When an empath enters a room, they don't simply notice what's happening emotionally, they absorb it, they hold it, they carry it home in their bones, and if they don't learn how to transmute that energy, it begins to destroy them from within. This is the danger of remaining a wounded healer instead of becoming a conscious one. Jung also taught that what we repress or avoid returns in symbolic form through dreams, projections, synchronicities, or physical symptoms. The empath often receives messages from the unconscious in such forms. Their dreams are vivid, sometimes prophetic, because they are open to the archetypal layer of the psyche. Their relationships are intense because they attract others who subconsciously sense their capacity to absorb pain. They experience synchronicities not occasionally but rhythmically because their soul is in constant dialogue with the divine. This mystic flow, however, can only be harnessed when the empath accepts their archetypal identity. Denying it leads to burnout, codependency, and spiritual confusion. Embracing it leads to power, presence, and purpose. Carl Jung saw the healer not as someone who fixes others, but as someone who facilitates transformation by being a living example of wholeness. The empath who heals must first heal themselves, not completely, but consciously. They must name their wounds, honor their past, and create boundaries that protect their aura. Only then does their pain become sacred. Only then does their aura shift from absorbing toxicity to radiating clarity. In this space, the empath evolves into what Jung might call a transparent vessel, someone who allows the path self to move through them without distortion. Their presence becomes healing not because of effort, but because of alignment. In mythological terms, the empath is both the pilgrim and the priestess, the seeker and the sanctuary. Their life is not about escaping sensitivity, but embodying it. With wisdom, Jung's work reminds us that true healing is not the absence of wounds, but the integration of them. The empath's gift, once purified through the fire of self-awareness, becomes a guiding light not only for themselves but for all those lost in emotional darkness. They are not here to drown in emotion but to walk upon it as a bridge to the soul. Through Jungian insight, the empath can finally understand their depth, claim their symbolic role, and emerge not just as a feeler, but as a transformer of energy, a steward of light within shadow, a rare soul equipped to remind the world of its unseen wholeness. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious serves as one of the foundational ideas for understanding the deep sensitivity and spiritual resonance of the empath. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is a vast, shared reservoir of ancestral memory, instinctual patterns, archetypes, and symbolic meaning that transcends personal experience. It is not individual, but universal. While most people tap into this layer unconsciously through myths, dreams, or synchronicities, the empath seems to have a natural sensitivity to this hidden domain. Their psychic openness makes them receptacles of collective energy, absorbing and reflecting back emotional truths that are often buried beneath layers of social conditioning or repression. The empath doesn't merely sense people's emotions, they tap into patterns that are archetypal in nature. They feel pain that didn't originate in them, yet courses through them as if it had. This is the mystery Jung described, that within each of us is something far older, wiser, and more interconnected than we dare to realize. Empaths often report feeling drained after being in crowds, overwhelmed by someone else's sadness, or inexplicably weighed down by emotional states they cannot trace back to a personal experience. This is not a matter of imagination or hypersensitivity. From a Jungian perspective, it is the psyche attuning itself to the deeper layers of shared human experience. The collective unconscious contains the full spectrum of human emotion: grief, rage, longing, shame, joy, and when an empath is present, they act almost like a tuning fork, picking up the vibrations of these unseen forces. The result is that empaths frequently suffer silently under the weight of energies they don't know how to process. They may take on the psychological projections of others, serving as containers for emotions society deems unacceptable, and yet it is precisely this ability to feel what others repress that makes the empath such a powerful force for healing. Jung taught that archetypes are the organizing principles within the collective unconscious. These include universal images, like the mother, the hero, the shadow, and the self. Empaths, often unconsciously, interact with these archetypes on a daily basis. For example, they might find themselves embodying the archetype of the caregiver or the healer, even in situations where they didn't choose to. Their lives may be filled with people who unconsciously seek out their nurturing energy, their ability to hold emotional space without judgment. This is not simply a personality trait, it's an archetypal function. The empath becomes a living expression of the archetypes that are most needed in their environment. This can become both a sacred calling and a heavy burden if the empath has not yet individuated, that is, if they have not yet separated their true identity from the roles they've been unconsciously assigned. Because of their direct access to archetypal material, empaths are often more dream-sensitive than others. Jung believed dreams are the language of the unconscious, and for empaths that language often comes with symbolic clarity. They may dream of water when overwhelmed with emotion, animals when instincts are being ignored, or recurring patterns that are not simply about their own psyche, but about the energies moving through their family, community, or even humanity as a whole. Jung called this phenomenon big dreams, those that carry collective meaning, not just personal insight. The empath is particularly attuned to these kinds of dreams. Their psychic sensitivity allows them to act as seers, drawing symbolic messages from the collective field and delivering them in ways that can provoke transformation. If not in words, then through presence and empathy itself. The empath's sensitivity is not random. Jung suggested that certain people are born with a psychic predisposition, a thinner veil between the conscious and unconscious realms. These individuals often become mystics, prophets, poets, and healers, and they walk the line between madness and spiritual revelation. The empath fits this description closely, because they operate so close to the boundary between the conscious and unconscious mind. They frequently experience psychic phenomena, intuitive knowing, prophetic insight, or emotional resonance that defies logic. They often pick up on the unspoken, the pain behind the smile, the grief hidden in silence. In Jungian terms, they are accessing the symbolic life. While others are caught in literalism, the empath hears the archetypal meaning behind. The moment they feel the soul of the situation, they absorb the psychic texture of a room not because they choose to, but because their unconscious mind is naturally porous to the collective field. Jung also emphasized the role of complexes, emotionally charged ideas and experiences, stored in the personal unconscious, which can be activated by events or people in our lives. Empaths are highly sensitive to the activation of complexes, both in themselves and in others. They can feel when someone else's inner child has been triggered or when a shadow complex has been stirred. They can sense emotional undercurrents that others have long buried. This sensitivity can be overwhelming if not managed with psychological boundaries, but it is also what enables empaths to bring emotional truth into the open. Their very presence has the potential to expose unconscious material that others would prefer to keep hidden. This is why empaths often face resistance or even rejection, not because they are wrong, but because they are mirrors. Jung taught that whatever we cannot face in ourselves, we project onto others. The empath often becomes the recipient of these projections, carrying the emotional weight that others are unwilling to claim. To understand the empath through Jung is to recognize them as vessels for the unconscious. They are the bridge between the individual and the collective, the conscious and the symbolic, the outer world and the inner life. Their pain often stems from being overwhelmed by what they cannot name. But their healing begins when they realize they are not weak. They are deeply connected. Their sensitivity is not dysfunction. It is perception on a spiritual level. It is the body responding to energies that most people have long forgotten how to feel. It is the soul trying to awaken, not only for itself but for others. In language, the empath lives in a state of potential individuation. They are closer to the symbolic world, and that proximity comes with both danger and power. The danger lies in being consumed by what they feel. The power lies in transforming it into insight, compassion, and conscious action. Through this lens, the empath becomes more than an emotional sponge. They become a symbolic mediator between the known and the unknown. Their aura carries frequencies that register pain, joy, trauma, healing, all encoded within the collective memory of humanity. The empath becomes not just a psychological type, but a spiritual function. Their lives are invitations to return to the depths we've forgotten, to remember the invisible forces shaping our experiences, and to listen once more to the subtle whispers of the collective soul. Jung didn't give us tools to escape this sensitivity, he gave us language and symbols to make meaning from it. And for the empath, meaning is everything. It is how they survive, it is how they heal, it is how they discover that their greatest pain is also their greatest portal into the mystery of the human soul. Shadow work is at the very heart of the empath's journey toward wholeness, and it is one of the most vital aspects of Carl Jung's psychological framework. To Jung, the shadow represents the unconscious part of the psyche that contains the aspects of ourselves we deny, reject, or suppress. It is not evil, as many assume, but simply hidden, composed of traits, instincts, emotions, and memories that the ego has pushed aside. For the empath, shadow work is particularly important because their extreme sensitivity often leads them to focus outward, on the emotions of others, rather than inward, on the truth of their own inner landscape. They may be skilled at reading the pain in others, but unaware of the suppressed pain within themselves. This creates an imbalance. Shadow work invites the empath to stop carrying everyone else's emotions and begin recognizing what unacknowledged energies they harbor within their own psyche. Without this, they risk emotional burnout, codependency, and spiritual confusion. But through shadow integration, they can reclaim their energy and evolve from a wounded feeler into an empowered healer. Empaths often experience emotional overwhelm because they are constantly absorbing psychic residue from their environment. However, what makes this dangerous is not only what they absorb from others, but what they avoid confronting in themselves. Jung taught that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. For the unhealed wounds, often originating in childhood, become part of the shadow and manifest in distorted patterns. These patterns may include people-pleasing, boundary collapse, fear of conflict, or an inability to say no. Because empaths are driven by the need to alleviate suffering, they often overextend themselves emotionally, believing it is their duty to heal others, even at the expense of their own well-being. Yet beneath this self-sacrifice may lie unacknowledged wounds of rejection, abandonment, or worthlessness. The unconscious belief that love must be earned through suffering is a shadow script many empaths unknowingly carry. To confront this script is to step into shadow work to see where love was once conditional, where safety was once absent, and where the mask of empathy hides a deeper longing for validation or connection. Shadow work demands brutal honesty. It calls the empath to look at not only the pain they've endured, but also the defense mechanisms they've developed in response. Some empaths develop a martyr complex, subconsciously believing that their pain makes them noble. Others become emotionally enmeshed with those they try to help, unable to distinguish between compassion and control. Still others avoid their shadow entirely by becoming spiritual bypassers, hiding behind positivity while refusing to deal with their own darkness. Jung warned against this tendency, stating that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. For the empath, spiritual growth is not about ascending beyond pain, but descending into it with consciousness and courage. This descent is where shadow work begins. It is the journey into the underworld of the psyche, where the broken parts of the self await healing through the light of awareness. One of the primary goals of shadow work is integration, the process of bringing unconscious content into conscious awareness so that it no longer controls us from behind the scenes. When an empath begins this work, they start to recognize the ways they have abandoned themselves emotionally. They begin to distinguish between true empathy and self-erasure. They learn that it is not their responsibility to carry everyone's burdens, and that enabling others can sometimes be a form of spiritual codependency. Shadow work teaches the empath to reclaim their inner authority, to honor their own emotions as valid, even when others are in pain. It allows them to stop projecting the healer archetype outward and begin embodying it inward. They move from rescuing others to rescuing the forgotten parts of themselves. In doing so, they cease to be defined by their wounds and begin to shape their own identity from a place of inner truth. Jung often spoke about the importance of accepting the entirety of the psyche, both light and dark, in order to become whole. He believed that confronting the shadow was not a one-time event, but a lifelong practice of integration. For the empath, this practice is essential, as their natural tendency is to remain in the realm of light, compassion, and healing. But the unacknowledged shadow festers in this space, leaking out in subtle and destructive ways. It shows up as resentment, emotional fatigue, guilt, and even illness. Jung observed that the shadow, when denied, will often express itself through somatic symptoms, the body bearing what the mind refuses to face. This is why so many empaths deal with chronic exhaustion, anxiety, and spiritual disorientation. They are unconsciously carrying emotional weight that needs to be processed, not suppressed. Shadow work gives them the tools to identify what belongs to them, what belongs to others, and what must be released in order to restore inner balance. In Jung's model, the integration of the shadow leads to individuation, the process of becoming one's true self. For empaths, individuation is both liberating and challenging. It requires that they stop identifying solely with the good, nurturing aspects of their personality and embrace their complexity. It asks them to look at the parts of themselves they have been taught to fear, anger, selfishness, power, pride, and see how these traits, when consciously integrated, can serve their growth. For instance, anger may become a signal of violated boundaries. Selfishness may become self-care. Power may become the capacity to lead with integrity, rather than seeing these traits as threats to their empathy. The conscious empath learns to see them as necessary components of personal wholeness. Through this process, the empath becomes stronger, clearer, and more resilient. They no longer absorb energy indiscriminately. They discern. They no longer give from depletion. They give from overflow, and they no longer seek to heal the world at the cost of their own soul. Jung also emphasized the necessity of owning the gold in the shadow, not just the darkness we fear, but the brilliance we've buried. Empaths often have spiritual gifts, intuitive insight, and creative genius that they've repressed out of fear of judgment or rejection. Shadow work helps them recover these hidden gifts. It allows them to reclaim the parts of themselves they once disowned in order to fit in, be loved, or avoid conflict. This retrieval of buried brilliance is what Jung called making the darkness conscious. It is not merely about uncovering wounds, but about discovering power. The empath, through this process, begins to see their aura shift from porous and vulnerable to radiant and sovereign. Their presence no longer reflects unhealed wounds, but integrated wisdom. Their energy no longer gets drained by chaos, because it is now aligned with clarity. In this way, shadow work becomes not just a personal practice, but a sacred rite. The empath steps into their true role not just as someone who feels deeply, but as someone who has transmuted pain into presence. They become a guide, not by teaching what they've read, but by embodying what they've lived. And it is through this embodiment that the empath becomes truly powerful, no longer a victim of emotional sensitivity, but a conscious steward of psychic energy, emotional truth, and soul integration. Through Jung's lens, this journey is not optional for the empath, it is essential. It is how they transform from one who absorbs pain into one who channels healing. It is how they move from fragmentation to fullness. And it is how they honor the sacred task of being born into this world with a heart capable of feeling what others deny, and a soul strong enough to face the darkness in order to reclaim the light. The empath's aura is more than an energetic field of sensitivity. It is a manifestation of their soul's journey through the psychological process Carl Jung called individuation. In Jungian thought, individuation is the unfolding of the self, the process through which a person becomes who they truly are. By integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, this is not simply about psychological health, but about spiritual wholeness. The empath, who is born with a heightened capacity to sense emotional and psychic energy, carries an aura that reflects both their inner state and the deeper movement of their soul. This aura is not just passive, it is alive, responsive, and deeply connected to the empath's ongoing spiritual evolution. It is an outward sign of inward truth. When an empath has not yet engaged in shadow work, boundary setting, or inner integration, their aura may be porous, erratic, or heavy. But as they walk the path of individuation, as they embrace their gifts and confront their wounds, their aura begins to stabilize, to radiate, to heal others without even speaking a word. Jung viewed the self as the totality of the psyche, encompassing the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. He saw the self not as a construct of the mind, but as an archetypal force, the divine image within. The empath's aura reflects their proximity to the self, whether consciously or unconsciously. When the ego is dominant, when the empath is fragmented, people-pleasing, or lost in emotional chaos, the aura becomes dim, scattered, and vulnerable. But as the empath begins to align with their inner self through dreams, inner dialogue, and active imagination, they begin to project a different energy. Their aura becomes a spiritual resonance field that not only protects them but serves as a healing vibration for others. People may not know why they feel safe, comforted, or convicted in the presence of an evolved empath, but the aura speaks louder than words. It is an extension of the soul, communicating on frequencies the mind cannot interpret. The aura, in Jungian terms, could be seen as the symbolic expression of the individuation process in motion. It holds traces of all the archetypes the empath has encountered and integrated: the inner child, the shadow, the wise elder, the divine feminine or masculine. When an empath has done their inner work, each of these archetypes becomes harmonized within the psyche, and this harmony radiates outward. Their aura becomes a vessel of balance, not because they never feel pain, but because they've learned how to alchemize it. In alchemical symbolism, which Jung drew upon heavily, the transformation of base materials into gold represents the transformation of raw emotion into spiritual insight. The empath's aura becomes the gold of this alchemical process. It glows with the essence of someone who has suffered, faced their inner demons, and emerged more whole, more human, more alive. Jung spoke often of symbols as the language of the unconscious. For the empath, the aura is a living symbol, a reflection of their inner world made visible through feeling. It shifts in accordance with their alignment. It brightens when they are in integrity. It darkens when they abandon. It becomes magnetic when they are standing in truth. This is not metaphysical fluff, but psychological reality for the empath. Because they are attuned to subtle energies, they can sense the shifts in their own aura before others even notice. They can feel when they've compromised themselves. They can sense when their soul is calling them back into alignment. The aura becomes a compass for the individuation journey. It guides them through resonance and dissonance, through heaviness and flow. As they learn to interpret its signals, they stop seeking external validation and begin to rely on the inner feedback system of their own soul energy. The journey toward aura refinement requires conscious engagement with all layers of the self. Jung emphasized the importance of not only embracing the light aspects of the personality but also facing the shadow, the repressed, rejected, and unloved parts of the psyche. As the empath begins to do this, something miraculous happens to their aura. It becomes grounded. Many empaths float above life, lost in intuition and sensitivity, but disconnected from the body. Their aura becomes overly open, vulnerable to energetic intrusion. But when they begin to claim their shadow, to honor their anger, to acknowledge their need for boundaries, their aura gains density. It roots itself in the body. It becomes a shield, not a sponge. This grounded aura is not closed, it is selective. It knows what to let in and what to release. It filters energy through the lens of the healed self, rather than the wounded ego. Empaths often carry ancestral patterns in their aura, unhealed trauma, emotional suppression, or spiritual gifts that have been passed down through generations. Jung referred to these inherited psychic structures as part of the collective unconscious. As empaths work through their own individuation, they are not just healing themselves, they are cleansing the energetic residue of their lineage. This process often shows up in dreams, visions, and emotional releases that seem disproportionate to one's personal story. But the empath understands on a deep level that they are moving energy not just for their own soul, but for those who came before. Their aura becomes a sacred space where generational pain is acknowledged and transformed. In doing so, the empath fulfills part of their spiritual contract to bring light into places that have been buried in silence. Jung described individuation as a spiral, not a straight line. The empath's aura reflects this spiral path, expanding and contracting, pulsing with insight, sometimes chaotic, sometimes crystalline. The more the empath surrenders to the rhythm of their soul, the more their aura stabilizes into a powerful frequency that acts as a mirror to others. Those who encounter the evolved empath are often confronted by their own disconnection or unresolved wounds. This is why some are drawn to empaths while others are repelled. The aura speaks truth. It reveals what words cannot, and for the empath, this can be both a gift and a burden. But as they continue to walk the path of individuation, they learn that their energy is not for everyone. It is for those who are ready. It is for those who are willing to meet themselves in the mirror of the empath's presence. Jung also spoke of the union of opposites, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, mind and body. This union is the ultimate aim of individuation. The empath who has integrated these polarities emits an aura that is both gentle and powerful, receptive and discerning, intuitive and grounded. Their energy no longer swings between extremes, it becomes centered. This centered aura acts as a sanctuary for others, a quiet reminder that wholeness is possible, that sensitivity is sacred, and that emotional depth is not a flaw, but a map to the divine. The empath becomes a living symbol of this truth. Their aura no longer signals trauma, exhaustion, or neglect. It radiates wisdom, compassion, and inner authority, not because they've avoided pain, but because they've honored it, learned from it, and transmuted it into presence. Jungian psychology. Symbols carry energy, and the empath becomes a symbol in themselves, a representation of the archetype of the seer, the healer, the alchemist. Their aura is the echo of their soul's journey, a field of resonance that tells the story of what they've overcome, what they've reclaimed, and what they've remembered. It is a silent testimony that healing is real, that depth is divine, and that the journey inward transforms everything it touches. Carl Jung's concept of synchronicity and inner alchemy offers a profound framework for understanding the empath's transformation from emotional overwhelm to spiritual power. Synchronicity, according to Jung, is the meaningful coincidence of inner psychological events and outer experiences that cannot be explained by cause and effect. For the empath, whose psyche is naturally porous and attuned to subtle energy, synchronicities are not rare anomalies, they are frequent, often serving as divine markers guiding them toward wholeness. These meaningful coincidences show up in dreams that foretell real-life events, chance encounters that answer inner questions, or signs and symbols that reflect their inner emotional reality. The empath, even if unaware of Jung's terminology, lives in a state of symbolic awareness. They often speak of the universe sending messages or feeling like something is trying to tell me something, which reflects their intuitive connection to the underlying patterns of life. This connection is not accidental. It is the result of their psychic receptivity, and Jung would argue that this sensitivity is the doorway through which synchronicity enters. Inner alchemy, another concept Jung drew heavily from ancient Hermeticism and Gnostic mysticism, is the transformation of the psyche through the integration of opposites. The empath's emotional and spiritual journey is an alchemical one, filled with inner conflicts, symbolic deaths, emotional fire, and eventual rebirth. Like the alchemist seeking to transmute lead into gold, the empath must turn emotional pain into wisdom, unconscious patterns into conscious truth, and scattered energies into unified wholeness. This is not a metaphorical luxury but a psychological necessity. Without this inner work, the empath remains in survival mode, hyper-aware, emotionally drained, and spiritually fragmented. But as they begin to recognize synchronicity as the language of the soul and engage in the inner work of transformation, they start to uncover the deeper meaning of their sensitivity. Their pain begins to make sense, their past begins to look like a curriculum, their emotional intensity, once seen as a flaw, becomes a portal into the sacred. Jung believed that synchronicity is evidence of a deeper order, a hidden architecture of meaning beneath the surface of our lives. For empaths whose inner lives are constantly communicating through dreams, feelings, sensations, and intuitive impressions, this order becomes visible. The empath may think of a person moments before they call. They may sense a shift in energy before a significant event occurs. They may feel drawn to certain symbols, feathers, numbers, animals, songs that later reveal deeper truths. This heightened synchronicity is a sign that the empath is in contact with the archetypal layer of reality. Their unconscious mind, which is already more open than most, becomes a receiver of spiritual data. The outer world responds to their inner state, and this mirroring effect helps guide their path. Jung would say this is not magic, but meaning in motion, the psyche participating in the unfolding of destiny. As the empath becomes more attuned to this synchronicity, they begin to engage in what Jung called active imagination, the process of dialoguing with the unconscious through images, symbols, and intuitive impressions. This is the beginning of inner alchemy. Through journaling, dream work, meditation, or contemplative creativity, the empath accesses parts of themselves that have been buried or disowned. They begin to see patterns, emotional loops, ancestral echoes, soul contracts that reveal what they are truly being called to heal. This healing does not occur on the surface. It requires a descent into the symbolic underworld, into grief, anger, confusion, and vulnerability. But the empath does not descend alone. Synchronicity becomes a companion. Just as the darkness rises, so to do signs appear. A mentor, a quote, a memory, a dream, affirming that the journey is meaningful. These synchronicities act like breadcrumbs from the soul, leading the empath through the fog of transformation toward clarity. Jungian alchemy is rooted in stages: negredo blackening, albedo whitening, citronitas yellowing, and rubate reddening. These stages mirror the empath's emotional evolution. Negredo is the confrontation with shadow, the chaos, confusion, and emotional despair that often marks the empath's early life. This is when they feel lost in others' emotions, unsure of who they are, consumed by emotional absorption. Albedo is the cleansing, the realization that healing is possible. and the first steps of self-awareness and boundary work begin. Citronitis is the awakening of inner wisdom when the empath starts to trust their intuition, reclaim their power, and interpret the symbolic language of the psyche. Rubido is the embodiment when the empath lives from a place of integrated truth, no longer absorbing energy but emanating clarity. Their aura changes, their choices shift, and their presence becomes transformational. This journey, though deeply personal, follows universal archetypal steps. It is not unique to one person, it is encoded in the collective soul, and the empath simply walks it more consciously throughout this alchemical process. Synchronicity becomes more than guidance, it becomes confirmation. The empath learns to trust not only their emotions but the signs around them. They begin to see the world as a mirror of the soul. Conversations carry messages. Nature reflects inner states. Encounters become turning points. Even moments of loss or heartbreak take on symbolic significance. The empath learns to decode the messages embedded in life's unfolding, and this decoding brings peace, empowerment, and alignment. They are no longer wandering aimlessly in emotional overwhelm. They are walking a sacred path. Jung believed that when a person aligns with their inner truth, the outer world responds. This is especially true for empaths whose very nervous systems seem designed to receive energetic feedback from the invisible realm. Their transformation is not just psychological, it is energetic, spiritual, and archetypal. Jung warned, however, that the alchemical process is not without danger. The empath who begins to awaken may become overwhelmed by the intensity of their perceptions. They may struggle to differentiate between genuine insight and projection, between intuition and fear. This is why grounding and discernment are critical. The empath must not only feel but also interpret. They must learn the symbolic language of their own psyche, develop emotional sovereignty, and walk with spiritual maturity. Otherwise, synchronicity can be misread, and inner alchemy can turn into spiritual bypassing. Jung encouraged balance, embracing both the mystical and the practical, the unconscious and the conscious, the inner and the outer. For the empath, this means becoming both spiritually awake and psychologically anchored. Only then can they hold the charge of their own transformation without becoming consumed by it. As the empath matures through this process, they become what Jung called an individuated person, someone who has realized their unique essence and is no longer dominated by collective norms, unconscious drives, or emotional chaos. Their life becomes an authentic expression of the self. Their relationships deepen, their purpose clarifies, their presence becomes a catalyst for healing. They no longer need to chase signs, because they have become one. They embody synchronicity. Their words, timing, and choices reflect alignment with something greater. People feel something shift when they speak. Environments feel different when they enter. This is not ego, it is essence. It is what happens when the empath completes their inner alchemical journey. They become a vessel for the divine intelligence that once whispered through symbols and now flows through them in wisdom, in peace, and in presence.